In today's news, the partial government shutdown that began at midnight on January 31st, 2026, marks a brief but significant lapse in federal funding for key agencies. This event stems from congressional gridlock over appropriations for fiscal year 2026, particularly disputes involving the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and immigration enforcement policies. As of today, January 31st, 2026, the shutdown is underway, but widely expected to be short-lived, potentially resolving as early as Monday, February 2nd, when the House reconvenes to vote on the Senate-passed deal. This explanation draws from publicly available news reports, government statements, and analyses, for example, from NPR, CBS News, The Guardian, BBC, Politico, and others. Background leading to the shutdown. The U.S. federal budget process requires Congress to pass 12 annual appropriations bills to fund government operations. For fiscal year 2026, October 1st, 2025 to September 30th, 2026, lawmakers struggled amid partisan divides. A prior record-long 43-day shutdown in late 2025 ended with a partial extension through January 30th, 2026, funding only select areas like agriculture, veterans affairs, and a few others. Additional bills later passed for commerce, justice, science, energy, interior, and environment. 6 major bills remained unresolved by late January 2026, covering critical departments: Defense, DoD/Pentagon, Homeland Security, DHS, Labor, Health and Human Services, HHS, Education, Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, HUD, State, Treasury, and Financial Services/General Government. These represent a large portion of federal spending and operations. The core dispute centered on DHS funding tied to President Donald Trump's mass deportation initiatives. In January 2026, federal immigration agents, including ICE and Border Patrol, were involved in 2 fatal incidents in Minneapolis, Minnesota: the shooting deaths of U.S. citizens Renee Good earlier in the month and Alex Priddy, an intensive care nurse, on January 23rd. These events sparked outrage, particularly among Democrats, who accused agents of overly aggressive tactics during raids and operations in cities. Democrats in the Senate, led by figures like Chuck Schumer, demanded reforms before approving long-term DHS funding. Proposed changes included requirements for body cameras, always on, no masks during operations, judicial warrants for arrests, ending roving patrols, visible agent identification, and independent probes into alleged misconduct. Republicans pushed back, viewing these as restrictions on enforcement, but negotiations intensified to avoid another prolonged crisis. By late January 29th to 30th, a bipartisan compromise emerged with White House involvement: 5 full-year appropriations bills for most agencies through September 30, 2026, plus a 2-week continuing resolution, CR, for DHS to allow further talks on reforms. The U.S. Capitol building at dusk, representing the site of intense negotiations and the government funding deadline. Exterior view of the U.S. Capitol with American flags symbolizing congressional debates over budget and policy. The Senate deal and why the shutdown still happened. On Friday, January 30, 2026, the Senate passed the package in a strong bipartisan 71-29 vote after late-night sessions. The deal funded agencies like DoD, HHS, Education, Transportation, HUD, State, and Treasury through the fiscal year end. DHS received only a short 2-week extension through mid-February to decouple it and enable separate reform discussions. President Trump publicly endorsed the agreement via social media and statements, urging quick passage to avoid disruptions and emphasizing national priorities. Senate leaders from both parties described it as a hard-won compromise. However, the bill required House approval and presidential signature. The House, Republican-controlled, had passed an earlier version but was in recess over the weekend and not scheduled to return until Monday, February 2nd. Without final enactment before midnight January 30/31, funding lapsed for the affected agencies, triggering partial shutdown procedures per Office of Management and Budget, OMB, guidance from Director Russ Vought. OMB directed agencies to begin orderly shutdown protocols. furloughing non-essential employees, halting non-critical operations, and maintaining essential functions, for example, national security, air traffic control in some cases, benefit payments where already obligated. Nighttime view of the lit-up U.S. Capitol, evoking the urgency of late-night Senate sessions before the funding deadline. The Capitol Dome under dramatic lighting, a classic visual for stories about government crises and shutdowns. Impacts of the partial shutdown. This is a partial shutdown, not total, because some agencies, for example, Agriculture, Veterans Affairs, Justice, were already fully funded earlier. Affected areas include Defense/Pentagon. Military operations continue, essential personnel exempt, but non-essential civilian work pauses. New contracts/modifications delayed. DHS. 2-week CR means immigration enforcement, including deportations, largely continues uninterrupted due to prior funding surges. HHS. Education, Labor, Transportation, HUD, Treasury, State. Furloughs possible for hundreds of thousands, delays in grants, loans, passport processing, regulatory work, housing assistance, and more. Economic ripple effects. Federal contractors face pauses, potential short-term hits to markets or services if extended. A brief lapse, for example over the weekend, causes minimal disruption. Many workers report Monday for shutdown tasks or await recall. Prolonged duration could echo 2025's $11 billion economic cost from the prior shutdown. Federal employees impacted may qualify for unemployment in some states. For example, Georgia DOL guidance notes furloughed workers as job attached. Protesters or federal workers demonstrating outside government buildings, representing potential public reactions to furloughs and service disruptions. Signs and crowds in a shutdown-related protest scene, useful for illustrating worker impacts or public discontent. Political context and reactions. The impasse highlights ongoing tensions in a divided Congress during Trump's second term. Democrats frame demands as basic accountability after citizen deaths during enforcement actions. Republicans emphasize border security and criticize delays. Trump supported the deal to project stability despite past shutdown history. Senate passage showed bipartisanship, but the procedural timing, House recess, ensured a weekend lapse. Outlets across the spectrum, NPR, CBS, Guardian, BBC, Politico, describe it as likely brief, with House action expected soon after reconvening. Image of President Donald Trump speaking or at a podium to represent his endorsement of the funding deal. A portrait or speaking image of Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, highlighting Democratic role in pushing for DHS reforms. Outlook and resolution path. The shutdown is expected to end quickly. House vote likely Monday, February 2nd, followed by Trump's signature. The 2-week DHS window allows negotiation on reforms without immediate enforcement halt. This event underscores recurring budget brinkmanship. Proposals like automatic continuing resolutions, for example, Prevent Government Shutdowns Act, aim to prevent future lapses. In summary, the January 31, 2026 partial shutdown is a procedural hiccup from a Senate-passed bipartisan deal awaiting House action, driven by immigration policy clashes but poised for swift resolution.